It was a sleepy American town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where summer fairs, high school football games, and Sunday services formed the rhythm of community life. Crime happened here, of course shoplifting. At the local convenience store, a fight outside the bar on payday night, but nothing too serious. That's why when the police announced they had arrested a man for burglary, the whole town seemed to stop and pay attention. The accused was Danny Miller, a 32-year-old auto mechanic who had spent most of his life in the same county. Danny wasn't the kind of man who drew attention. He worked at a small garage on the edge of town, fixed engines for fair prices, and occasionally volunteered to help coach Little League baseball. To most, he was quiet, polite, and dependable. So when his mugshot appeared in the local paper beneath the headline, "Local Mechanic Arrested in Late-Night Break-In," neighbors shook their heads in disbelief. The crime itself had rattled nerves more than usual, because it wasn't just any burglary. It was the burglary of Councilman Robert Halston's home, one of the most respected men in town. Halston, a figure of authority and pride, claimed he'd been asleep upstairs when an intruder slipped into his study. Jewelry, a laptop, and several personal files disappeared. The loss wasn't just financial. It felt like a violation of the town's sense of security. Police wasted no time in launching an investigation. What made the case unusual was how quickly they announced they had their suspect. Within 48 hours, Daniel Miller was arrested at his small rental home. The evidence, at least on paper, sounded compelling. The police had brought in Rex, the department's most decorated K9, to the scene. Rex was no ordinary dog. He had been involved in over a dozen major arrests and was known for his near-flawless tracking record. His handler, Officer Reynolds, testified that Rex had followed a scent trail from Halston's study out into the street, across several blocks, and directly to Miller's property. For many in the town, that was all they needed to hear. A police dog was trusted almost like a human officer, perhaps even more. Dogs didn't lie, didn't get bribed, didn't hold grudges at least. That's what people liked to believe. If Rex had led them to Danny Miller's door, then surely the man must have been guilty. But beneath the surface, the case wasn't as airtight as it appeared. There were no fingerprints tying Danny to the study. The surveillance camera on Halston Street had malfunctioned that night, showing only a grainy blur of a figure that could have been anyone. The items stolen had not been recovered. All the prosecution truly had was the word of the police department and the paws of a dog. When Danny appeared in court for the first hearing, the courthouse buzzed with energy. Reporters filled the front benches, eager to cover the trial. Housewives whispered about how shocking it was that a man they'd once trusted with their car engines could have committed such a crime. Some said he must have been desperate for money. Others suggested maybe he held some hidden grudge against Councilman Halston. And yet, a smaller group, his old baseball teammates, a few loyal customers, his neighbors insisted that Danny was incapable of such an act. Danny himself remained mostly silent. He pleaded not guilty, his voice low but steady. His attorney, a weary public defender named Marissa Cole, knew the uphill battle she faced. Jurors tended to believe police dogs without question. To them, Rex wasn't just a dog. He was a symbol of loyalty, courage, and truth. Fighting against that was like shouting into the wind. Still, Marissa studied the case carefully. She noticed small cracks in the story. For one, Rex had supposedly tracked the scent across several city blocks, through areas full of pedestrians, cars, and distractions. That wasn't impossible, but it was less certain than the prosecution claimed. Second, the timeline of the burglary and the arrest left questions. Danny had been home with his son when officers arrived, and his neighbors testified they saw nothing unusual that night. The judge, a stern man with graying hair named Judge Alcott was determined to keep proceedings orderly. He reminded the jury that their duty was to weigh evidence carefully, not to rely on assumptions. But even he seemed intrigued by the idea of a dog playing such a central role in a high-profile trial. It wasn't every day that the fate of a man rested on an animal's instincts. The first few days of the trial moved with a strange rhythm. The prosecution paraded witnesses, mostly police officers, who described the burglary scene in detail. Councilman Halston testified about the items stolen, his voice tinged with righteous indignation. But the true centerpiece of the prosecution's case remained Rex and his handler. Officer Reynolds described how the dog had been trained, his long career, his reputation for accuracy. Each time Rex's name was mentioned, jurors straightened slightly, as though listening to something sacred. It was clear that for many, their trust in the K9 was unwavering. Danny sat quietly at the defense table, his eyes flicking occasionally to his son, who sat in the back row with his grandmother. A boy, barely 3 years old, didn't understand the proceedings. He only knew that his father looked tired, that people spoke in sharp voices, and that everyone seemed to be waiting for something important to happen. It was in these moments that the atmosphere of the trial grew heavy. The town had turned the courtroom into a stage. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Would Danny be convicted swiftly, condemned by the wordless judgment of a police dog? Or would his lawyer manage to sow enough doubt to make the jury hesitate? What? No. One realized not the judge, not the attorneys, not even Danny himself, was that the most pivotal voice of the entire trial was not yet heard. It wasn't the voice of the councilman, the police, or the lawyers. It wasn't even the bark of the decorated K9. The voice that would leave the jury speechless belonged to someone no one expected, a toddler with wide eyes and unshakable innocence, who would speak only once, but whose words would echo louder than any argument ever could. The stage was set. The town held its breath. The trial of Daniel Miller had already become the most talked about case in years, but the moment that would enter local legend was still waiting in the wings. The morning sun spilled golden light across the courthouse steps, and townspeople began gathering even before the doors opened. Word had spread quickly that the trial of Daniel Miller had taken a peculiar turn. While most court cases in this sleepy town followed predictable rhythms, testimony, objections, and occasional outbursts, this trial promised something different. People whispered that the defendant's toddler would be present in the courtroom. It was unusual, even controversial, but the judge had made a rare allowance. A 3-year-old in a courtroom was unheard of, yet somehow the small boy had become part of the narrative. The toddler's name was Lucas Miller, Danny's youngest, with bright eyes and hair that fell in soft curls over his forehead. Lucas had little understanding of the legal proceedings around him. At home, he spent mornings stacking blocks, afternoons chasing his toy car across the living room, and evenings clinging to his father for bedtime stories. Courtrooms were strange places, full of towering adults, sharp voices, and unfamiliar faces. Yet Lucas, unaware of the magnitude of the trial, sensed something different. He saw worry in his father's eyes, urgency in his grandmother's movements, and tension in the faces of strangers who spoke too loudly or too sharply. Marissa Cole, Danny's attorney, had fought hard to allow Lucas in the courtroom. The public defender argued that his presence was essential not for legal testimony, but for the subtle human truths he might reveal. Judges rarely made exceptions for children in cases this serious, but Judge Alcott had agreed, recognizing that the toddler might hold unique insights into his father's character or the events of that night. The courtroom had agreed quietly. The boy's presence was symbolic, a reminder that beyond legal arguments and police reports, real lives were affected. The day Lucas arrived, the courtroom hummed with quiet curiosity. Spectators craned their necks to glimpse the boy as he clutched his grandmother's hand. Cameras flashed, though reporters were careful to keep the angle respectful. For Lucas, the courthouse was a world apart from his home. The polished wood floors, the tall benches, and the uniformed officers seemed enormous, even intimidating. Still, he did not cry. Instead, he walked slowly to the designated seat, holding tight to the toy car he always carried. His wide eyes flicked nervously between strangers, the police officers, and the looming figure of Rex, a German shepherd, sitting obediently beside Officer Reynolds. Rex's presence was calm yet commanding. The dog's coat gleamed under the courtroom lights, his posture perfectly straight, ears alert. Everyone in the room had come to respect him as more than an animal. He was, in their eyes, a guardian of truth. And yet, Lucas approached him with nothing but curiosity. Unlike the adults, he didn't see an emblem of authority or a symbol of judgment. He saw only a creature with fur, eyes, and a tail, a being who had briefly visited him at home that fateful night. As the trial progressed, the courtroom settled into a rhythm. Witnesses gave testimony about the burglary, the police procedures, and the K-9's tracking abilities. Danny's neighbors were called to confirm timelines, some repeating that they had seen nothing unusual. Other witnesses described the precision and training of Rex. Each word seemed to weigh heavier on Danny, and yet his calm demeanor, the occasional reassuring smile to Lucas, betrayed nothing. The presence of the toddler created an unusual energy. It was a reminder to everyone that behind the evidence, behind the procedures, there was human life at stake. Lucas, meanwhile, watched everything with a quiet attentiveness that no adult could fully explain. He didn't understand the concept of guilt or innocence, or what it meant to be on trial. But he remembered a detail from the night of his father's arrest. He remembered Rex entering the house, sniffing carefully, and looking at his father not with anger, but with curiosity. In a child's mind, that detail was vivid, undeniable. He had seen his father plead with the officers, had seen the dog tilt his head in a way that suggested recognition rather than accusation. And now, sitting in the courtroom, he felt an urge to speak, to convey what he knew in the only way he could. Marissa watched Lucas closely from the defense table. She knew children were unpredictable, and Lucas's temperament could turn tense moments into chaos or, if channeled carefully, provide a moment of clarity. She adjusted her glasses, whispered softly to him, and encouraged him to sit still, explaining in gentle words that he was there to help his father by being calm and quiet. Lucas nodded, though his curiosity remained. He leaned slightly forward in his chair, eyes fixed on Rex, seeming to analyze the dog in a way that no one else did. As the morning session progressed, tension in the courtroom began to build. The prosecution presented charts, diagrams, and detailed accounts of the K-9's tracking procedure. Officer Reynolds demonstrated how Rex had followed the scent, narrating with precision the path from Councilman Halston's study to Danny's property. Jurors watched intently, taking notes, whispering quietly to each other. The courtroom was silent, except for the occasional shuffle of papers or scribble of pen on pad. Yet in this silence, a quiet energy radiated from Lucas. His eyes shifted, constantly observing Rex, his father, and the interactions around him. Then came the moment that would later be remembered as pivotal. The bailiff held a brief recess. Most adults turned to gossip quietly or check their phones. Lucas, however, remained fixated on Rex. The dog, sensing a lull, lowered his head slightly, ears relaxed. Lucas leaned forward and whispered, barely audible to anyone, "It wasn't Daddy." No one heard him clearly, but the intensity in his gaze suggested he had said something important. Marissa's heart quickened, realizing that the child's instincts, unfiltered by courtroom decorum, might carry weight in unexpected ways. She subtly gestured for Lucas to sit back, murmuring that it was almost time for the canine demonstration. Lucas nodded again, gripping his toy car, but his eyes never left the dog. When the courtroom reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted slightly. The audience sensed something different in the air, though no one could quite articulate it. Lucas's brief moment of observation had gone unnoticed by most, yet in the defense's eyes, it was a small signal of what was to come. The child's memory of the night, combined with his instinctive perception of Rex, created a tension that lawyers could not manufacture. As witnesses were called to demonstrate Rex's tracking skills again, Lucas sat forward once more. His small hands gripped the edge of the seat. The dog, obedient as ever, followed Officer Reynolds' instructions. But Lucas's gaze remained unwavering. He had already made a quiet judgment in his mind. To him, the dog's behavior did not indicate guilt. It suggested recognition, familiarity, not condemnation. It was a simple observation, yet one that would soon ripple across the courtroom in ways no one expected. By midday, reporters were scribbling notes about the unusual presence of the toddler. Some laughed quietly, remarking on how odd it was to see a 3-year-old in a courtroom. Others whispered, more seriously, that children sometimes see things adults overlook. Lucas's innocence, coupled with his quiet attentiveness, made the air electric with anticipation. No one could predict what would happen next, but everyone could sense that this was no ordinary trial. In the back row, Lucas' grandmother held his hand gently. She had grown used to the rhythms of life in a courtroom, but even she was surprised by the child's focus. "Just sit still, Lucas," she whispered. "Watch and listen." Lucas obeyed, though his mind remained sharp, cataloging every movement, every expression, every subtle interaction between his father and the dog. It was as if, in his small mind, he understood something profound that the adults had not yet grasped. By the end of the day, the courtroom had witnessed standard legal proceedings, testimony, evidence presentation, and careful observation of the canine's tracking ability. Yet the real tension, the unspoken anticipation, lay in the quiet presence of Lucas Miller. Though the adults debated evidence, replayed police reports, and scrutinized diagrams, the child watched and waited. Something in him understood the truth, that sometimes innocence could reveal what logic and authority could not. As the court adjourned for the day, murmurs filled the hallways. The case had already captivated the town, but no one realized that the pivotal moment, the one that would leave the jury speechless, was silently building in the mind of a 3-year-old boy. Lucas Miller, the unexpected witness, would soon speak a single, unforgettable sentence that would ripple across the room, challenging assumptions, shaking beliefs, and leaving a courtroom full of adults questioning everything they thought they knew. And so, the stage was set. The trial, already unusual because of Rex, the decorated police dog, had taken on a new layer of intrigue. Now, the small, silent, observant child sat at the center of a story that the town would retell for years. His presence, unassuming yet electric, marked the beginning of a moment when innocence would intersect with justice in a way no one could anticipate. The courthouse was unusually silent as the morning sun spilled through the tall, arched windows. The smell of polished wood mixed with the faint scent of old paper, creating a sense of gravity that hung over every corner of the room. The audience had gathered earlier than usual, a mix of townspeople, reporters, and distant relatives who had heard about the unusual twist in the Miller trial. Everyone had come to see not only Daniel Miller, the accused, but also the young child whose presence had already begun to intrigue the courtroom. Lucas Miller, the toddler at the center of attention, clutched his grandmother's hand as they entered the courtroom. His toy car, always a source of comfort, was tucked under his arm. He didn't understand the seriousness of the proceedings, but he felt the tension radiating from the adults around him. To Lucas, the courtroom was a strange, almost magical place, a world of towering people, deep voices, and uniforms that commanded respect. Yet his attention was not drawn to the judge, the attorneys, or even the gallery. It was drawn to Rex, the German shepherd, sitting calmly beside Officer Reynolds, his eyes sharp, his body still. The judge, Judge Alcott, banged his gavel lightly to signal the start of the day's session. His gray hair framed a stern face, and his voice carried the authority that kept order in the room. "We will proceed with today's hearing," he said, scanning the courtroom carefully. "I remind all present that decorum must be maintained. Everyone is expected to respect the court's procedures." Danny Miller sat at the defense table, his posture calm, though his jaw was tight with worry. He glanced at Lucas briefly, offering a reassuring nod. The boy returned the gesture with a small smile, gripping his toy car tightly as if it were a shield. Danny's lawyer, Marissa Cole, whispered softly to him, "Stay calm. Let's just get through this part." She then turned her attention to the jury, who were observing the room intently, pens poised above their notebooks. The prosecution rose first, presenting a new witness, a neighbor who claimed to have heard unusual noises the night of the burglary. His testimony was detailed, yet flawed. He admitted later that he had only glanced out the window briefly and wasn't certain of what he saw. The jury listened politely, taking notes, but their focus kept drifting to the front of the room where the canine officer remained, sitting quietly, every muscle in his body controlled and alert. The dog's presence added an almost surreal dimension to the proceedings, creating a mix of awe and unease among the jurors. As the witness finished, the defense began its cross-examination. Marissa Cole asked pointed questions about the reliability of human perception, the potential for mistakes, and the limitations of the neighbor's observations. She emphasized that the night in question had been dark, and that movement outside the home could easily be misinterpreted. Her words were precise, yet calm, delivered in a manner that drew the jury's attention without creating confrontation. Danny's hope rested in the jurors' ability to weigh these subtleties against the more dramatic evidence being presented by the prosecution. Then came the demonstration of Rex's tracking abilities, a moment everyone had been waiting for. Officer Reynolds stood, leash in hand, and motioned for the dog to follow the scent trail once more. The German shepherd moved with fluid precision, tracing a path that led from the courtroom's designated crime scene markers to a small area near Danny's desk. The jury watched in silence, some impressed by the dog's skill, others visibly skeptical. It was a performance in itself, a living, breathing piece of evidence that carried weight beyond any human witness. Lucas's eyes never left Rex. He leaned slightly forward in his chair, his tiny fingers gripping the edge. Something about the dog's movements stirred a memory within him. He remembered that night vividly, though in fragments, a flash of fur, a soft whine, a moment when Rex paused and looked at his father, not with aggression, but with recognition. To Lucas, that memory carried clarity that adults couldn't grasp. He had seen truth in Rex's eyes, and now he was trying to reconcile that memory with the demonstration before him. The courtroom felt heavy. Every shuffle of papers, every whispered comment among the jury, every click of a pen seemed amplified. Reporters scribbled furiously, sensing that the trial was approaching an unusual crescendo. The townspeople in the gallery whispered among themselves, debating the credibility of the evidence, the reliability of the K-9 officer, and the inexplicable presence of a toddler in a case of this magnitude. Some muttered that it was absurd. Others suggested that perhaps the child's perspective might reveal truths the adults had missed. Marissa Cole decided to take a subtle risk. She called Lucas closer, asking him to sit near the demonstration area. "Just sit here for a moment, Lucas," she whispered, guiding him gently. "Watch the dog and tell us what you see." The toddler obeyed, positioning himself so that he could observe Rex without obstruction. His small face was serious, concentrated, as if he understood that this was a moment of importance, even though he had no concept of the courtroom's rules or the legal stakes involved. The prosecution objected briefly, arguing that the child's presence could be disruptive, that he might misinterpret what he saw. Judge Alcott, however, dismissed the objection with a wave of his hand. He was curious, perhaps even intrigued, by how the child might affect the jury. "Let him be," the judge said. "We will see what value his perspective may bring. Proceed." Lucas's gaze locked onto Rex, and something shifted in the courtroom's energy. The audience felt it, even if they couldn't articulate it. A quiet, almost imperceptible tension, as if the truth were about to reveal itself in an unexpected form. He watched the dog, watched his father, and reflected on the fragment of that night he had stored in his memory. And then, just as the demonstration concluded, Lucas did something no one anticipated. He leaned slightly forward and spoke, softly at first, but with remarkable certainty. "It wasn't Daddy," he said, his voice barely audible to most, but sharp enough that Marissa Cole caught it immediately. The courtroom froze. A few spectators glanced around in confusion, unsure if they had heard correctly. Officer Reynolds paused mid-motion, a leash slack in his hand, as if sensing that something profound had been uttered. The jurors shifted in their seats, some leaning forward, their expressions a mix of surprise and curiosity. Even Judge Alcott paused, eyebrows raised. Marissa Cole felt a surge of hope. She realized that the child's innocence, his unfiltered perception, had just introduced an element that no argument, no diagram, no demonstration could replicate. Lucas hadn't analyzed evidence in the adult sense. He had observed, remembered, and spoken from pure instinct. And in doing so, he had cast doubt on the prosecution's case, not through logic, but through authenticity. The audience remained tense, unsure how to react. Some whispered, glancing at one another. Others stared in silence, feeling the weight of what had just occurred. The prosecution faltered momentarily, unable to immediately respond to the simple, undeniable truth in full. A child's statement. Danny himself felt a strange sense of relief. His son had spoken what his own heart knew, that the evidence wasn't conclusive, that Rex's behavior did not condemn him. Throughout the rest of the morning, a subtle shift occurred. Jurors, who had leaned toward accepting the dog's tracking as definitive, began to reconsider. Observers noticed their pens paused over notes, their expressions thoughtful rather than decisive. The energy in the courtroom had changed, transformed by a voice so small, so pure, that it could not be ignored. Lucas had become the silent influencer of the trial, a witness whose impact exceeded any legal precedent. By lunchtime, everyone in the courtroom sensed that the trial had entered a new phase. What had started as a standard burglary case had evolved into something far more compelling, a story about truth, perception, and the ways innocence could challenge authority. Lucas remained calm, his toy car clutched in one hand, his gaze occasionally meeting his father's. It was as if he understood the magnitude of the moment without knowing the rules, the stakes, or the consequences. As the court recessed, murmurs filled the hallways. Reporters speculated about the impact of a toddler's statement. Lawyers exchanged uneasy glances, recognizing that the simplest truth could disrupt even the most carefully constructed cases. And in the back of the courtroom, Lucas Miller sat quietly, unaware of the legend he was beginning to create. The tense courtroom of that morning had transformed into something far more alive, a place where every observer, juror, and participant realized that justice was not only about procedure, evidence, or authority. It was about perception, honesty, and the unexpected clarity that could emerge from the purest of voices. And in that room, one small child, sitting quietly with his grandmother, was about to show everyone just how powerful innocence could be. The courtroom buzzed with an almost imperceptible energy as the morning session began. Reporters and spectators had taken their seats early, the tension palpable in the air. Whispers circulated quietly about the unusual circumstances of the trial. How a decorated police dog, Rex, was being treated as a central piece of evidence, and how the defendant's toddler, Lucas Miller, had been permitted to sit in the courtroom. Many had never seen a case quite like this, and curiosity alone filled the room with anticipation. Today, it seemed, the trial would reach a point no one could ignore. Rex, the German Shepherd, had been a fixture in the department for over 6 years. Known for his disciplined behavior and uncanny tracking abilities, he had been involved in high-profile cases across the county. Every officer who spoke of him seemed to convey a mixture of pride and awe, emphasizing his accuracy, loyalty, and intelligence. In this trial, Rex had become more than a dog. He was a living, breathing symbol of authority, justice, and perceived truth. His handler, Officer Reynolds, stood beside him, leash in hand, moving with precise, controlled motions, ensuring that the dog's presence remained commanding yet unobtrusive. The moment the bailiff called Rex into the courtroom, a hush fell over the audience. Spectators shifted in their seats, and journalists raised cameras, some cautiously, others eagerly, hoping to capture a photograph that could define the day. Rex entered calmly, his coat shining under the courtroom lights. Every movement was measured, deliberate, a testament to years of rigorous training. His eyes, dark and alert, scanned the room, catching every motion, every nuance, but always returning to the task at hand. Lucas Miller's gaze immediately fixed on Rex. The toddler had seen the dog before, fleetingly, on the night of the arrest. Though he had been frightened at first, he had also sensed something familiar in the animal's eyes, a recognition that went beyond aggression or training. Now, sitting quietly near the demonstration area, Lucas leaned forward slightly, gripping his toy car. He didn't fully understand the concept of guilt or innocence, but he remembered what he had observed that night. And something deep inside him told him that Rex's presence could reveal a truth adults had overlooked. Officer Reynolds began the demonstration. He instructed Rex to trace the path the dog had followed during the investigation. Every step was precise. The dog's paws barely made a sound on the polished floor as he moved from one marker to another, pausing occasionally to sniff, assess, and continue. The jury watched in silence, some impressed, others skeptical. But no one in the room could deny the majesty of the moment, the grace, focus, and discipline of a dog trained for years to execute tasks that required both instinct and intelligence. Marissa Cole, Danny's attorney, observed quietly from the defense table. She noted subtle cues in Rex's behavior, slight pauses or head tilts, that suggested the dog was responding to environmental signals rather than absolute certainty about guilt. She leaned down to whisper to Danny, "Watch carefully. Even the best trained instincts aren't foolproof." Danny nodded slightly, his expression tense but hopeful. His eyes never left Lucas, who sat upright, completely absorbed in the scene before him. As the demonstration continued, Lucas' memory became sharper. He remembered the night vividly. Rex had paused at the edge of the living room, looking directly at his father, not with suspicion, but with recognition. The dog's body language had been different than what the adults in the courtroom might have interpreted. A small pause, a tilt of the head, a soft whine that suggested curiosity rather than accusation. That memory stayed with Lucas, solid and clear, as if it had been etched into his mind. Rex completed the path Officer Reynolds had set, returning to the front of the courtroom. A murmur ran through the gallery. For many jurors, the demonstration was conclusive proof of the prosecution's case. The dog had followed the scent trail directly to Danny's property, and some interpreted that as irrefutable evidence. But for Lucas, the demonstration was different. It did not confirm guilt. Instead, it highlighted what he had seen the night of the arrest, the nuance in Rex's behavior, the momentary hesitation, the subtle look toward his father that suggested familiarity rather than condemnation. Marissa Cole seized the moment to subtly redirect the narrative. She asked Lucas to observe the dog closely and report what he noticed. "Lucas," she said softly, crouching to his level, "watch Rex and tell us if you see anything unusual." Lucas leaned forward, eyes fixed on the German Shepherd, his small hands gripping the edge of the chair. The room seemed to hold its breath, sensing the weight of this simple act. A child observing a decorated police dog. How could anyone predict what might emerge? The prosecution shifted uncomfortably. They had relied on Rex's reputation, on the assumption that the dog's tracking ability was beyond question. Now, a child was about to offer a perspective that no expert testimony could counter. The tension in the room was almost tangible, a mixture of curiosity, disbelief, and anticipation. Officer Reynolds remained calm, but even he felt the unusual weight of the moment. A toddler, sitting quietly, had the potential to influence the courtroom in ways no one could have imagined. Lucas watched intently. He remembered the way Rex had looked at his father that night, and he remembered the fleeting sense of recognition, the subtle pause, the soft whine. These details were vivid in his memory. And then, leaning forward slightly, his small voice rose above the hush. "That dog knows it wasn't him," he said. The words echoed in the silent courtroom. For a moment, no one moved. Jurors glanced at one another, unsure whether they had heard correctly. Reporters paused mid-scribble, cameras frozen. The prosecution faltered, unsure how to respond. Even Judge Alcott blinked, a hint of surprise crossing his stern features. The toddler's simple statement carried a weight that logic, procedure, and training could not replicate. Marissa Cole felt a surge of hope. The child's innocence had cut through layers of complexity, exposing a nuance that adults had missed. Lucas hadn't analyzed evidence or questioned procedure. He had observed and remembered. His small, clear voice conveyed a truth that resonated deeply. Rex's behavior, while impressive, did not indicate guilt. There was recognition in the dog's eyes, a familiarity that no diagram, chart, or expert testimony could explain. The courtroom remained suspended in that moment. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably, reconsidering what they had assumed. Observers whispered quietly among themselves, unsure whether to laugh, marvel, or remain silent. The simple, unfiltered truth, spoken by a child, had altered the energy in the room, creating a tension that everyone felt, but no one could articulate fully. Danny Miller's chest lifted slightly. His son had spoken what his own heart knew. The K-9 officer, the symbol of certainty for the prosecution, was suddenly seen in a new light. It was not evidence of guilt, but a witness to nuance, perception, and instinct. And it was a child, a 3-year-old, who had reminded everyone that even the most disciplined eyes could be interpreted in different ways. The remainder of the morning passed with a quiet, careful deliberation. Witnesses continued to testify. Charts were presented, and Officer Reynolds offered explanations of the dog's movements. But the courtroom had changed. The simple, clear statement of a toddler had introduced a doubt that no expert, diagram, or demonstration could erase. The energy in the room was now electric, a sense of anticipation hovering over every interaction, every glance, every whispered remark. By noon, reporters were scribbling furiously, trying to capture the unusual dynamics of the trial. Jurors appeared thoughtful. Pens paused above notes, as if replaying the toddler's words in their minds. Spectators whispered quietly, acknowledging that the courtroom had been transformed by an unexpected voice. And Lucas, sitting quietly with his toy car, remained oblivious to the magnitude of his impact. For him, it was a simple observation, a memory recalled. Yet that observation would ripple through the trial, shaping perceptions, judgments, and ultimately, the course of justice itself. As the court recessed for lunch, murmurs filled the hallways. Spectators speculated about the role of a child's insight in a trial, dominated by trained police testimony. Lawyers exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that innocence had just claimed a place at the center of the courtroom. And in the back of the room, Lucas Miller remained calm, eyes occasionally meeting his father's, a subtle smile forming on his face. The German shepherd sat obediently beside Officer Reynolds, unaware of the monumental role he had played or of the small, perceptive witness whose voice had already changed the course of the trial. In that moment, the trial of Daniel Miller had shifted. What had begun as a standard burglary case had evolved into something extraordinary, a story about perception, instinct, and the unexpected clarity that comes from innocence. And at the center of it all, sitting quietly with his grandmother, was Lucas Miller, the unexpected witness, whose observations would leave the jury, the courtroom, and the town forever changed. The courtroom had been tense all morning, filled with the quiet hum of anticipation. Reporters scribbled notes, jurors leaned forward, and spectators whispered in low voices. But nothing could have prepared anyone for what was about to unfold. Lucas Miller, the 3-year-old son of the accused, had been observing the proceedings intently. His bright eyes, full of curiosity and innocence, followed every subtle movement of Rex, the German shepherd at the center of the prosecution's case. The dog's trained precision, the officer's calm commands, and the silent focus of the jury all created an almost surreal atmosphere. Lucas didn't understand the trial. He didn't know terms like burglary or evidence, and he couldn't comprehend the weight of his father's possible conviction. What he did understand, however, was something fundamental. He remembered the night of the arrest, the fleeting moment when Rex had paused and looked at his father, not with hostility, but with recognition. It was a memory etched in clarity, one of instinct, trust, and observation that adults had failed to notice. And now, seated at the front of the courtroom, Lucas felt compelled to express it. Marissa Cole, Danny's defense attorney, leaned down to the boy and spoke softly. "Lucas, you've been watching carefully. Can you tell us what you see?" Lucas shifted slightly, gripping his toy car in one hand. His small brow furrowed as he studied Rex, his eyes narrowing in concentration. For a moment, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Spectators, jurors, and even the judge sensed that something extraordinary was about to happen, though none of them knew what form it would take. The toddler's lips parted, and in a voice that was innocent yet unwavering, he spoke. It wasn't Daddy. The words, so simple and clear, hung in the air like a lightning bolt. The courtroom froze. The jury, once absorbed in procedural details and testimony, sat in stunned silence. Some jurors exchanged glances, unsure if they had heard correctly. The prosecution faltered, caught off guard by the audacity of a 3-year-old offering what seemed like a definitive statement on the case. Reporters paused mid-scribble, pens hovering over notebooks, trying to capture the moment that had suddenly eclipsed all other evidence. Even Judge Alcott, a man known for his stern demeanor and quick control of proceedings, blinked in surprise. He leaned slightly forward on the bench, eyebrows raised, as if weighing the significance of the boy's words. Did the child just speak? He murmured to himself, a hint of curiosity in his tone. The courtroom, normally a place of strict order and procedure, had shifted into a state of charged anticipation. The innocence of a child had introduced a force that no one, no matter their experience, could ignore. Danny Miller's eyes filled with a mixture of relief and disbelief. His son had spoken the truth that he had known all along. Rex's presence and behavior did not prove guilt. There had been hesitation in the dog's movements, a moment of recognition that contradicted the prosecution's narrative. That hesitation, clear to a child who had witnessed it firsthand, now reverberated throughout the room. For Danny, Lucas' statement was a lifeline, a small but powerful affirmation of his innocence. Marissa Cole moved quickly, though carefully, to capitalize on the moment. She addressed the jury in measured tones, emphasizing the unique perspective that children can offer. "Members of the jury," she said softly but clearly, "this little boy has seen what adults may have overlooked. He observed the interactions that night, and his perspective is honest, pure, and untainted by bias. He has stated what he saw with clarity that even trained observers could misinterpret." Her words were deliberate, giving weight to Lucas' statement without forcing the jury to accept it as formal evidence. The prosecution, for the first time, appeared unsure. They had relied heavily on Rex's impeccable reputation and the perceived authority of his tracking abilities. But now, a child's simple observation had cast doubt on that authority. Officer Reynolds, the dog's handler, shifted slightly, though he maintained his composure. Even the most disciplined and experienced individuals felt a subtle disruption in the narrative they had controlled for weeks. The courtroom was no longer predictable. It was alive, pulsing with the tension between innocence and authority, instinct and procedure. Lucas remained seated, his small hands gripping his toy car. He didn't know the impact of his words, but he sensed that adults were listening in a new way. He looked briefly at his father, who nodded encouragingly, and then back at Rex, the German shepherd, trained to respond to commands and guidance, now seemed part of a larger narrative beyond obedience, a witness in a drama that extended far beyond his training. The jurors were visibly affected. Some leaned forward, pens paused in mid-air. Others exchanged whispered glances, eyes reflecting doubt and contemplation. It was clear that Lucas' words had forced them to reconsider the events they had been evaluating for days. What adults had interpreted through procedure and training was suddenly seen through the unfiltered lens of a child's honesty. The impact was subtle, yet profound, altering perceptions without the need for argument or analysis. Marissa Cole seized the moment further. She asked Lucas gently to explain, in his own words, what he had meant. The boy looked at Rex, then at his father, then back at the audience of adults who were hanging on every gesture. "He knows Daddy didn't do it," Lucas said, his voice small but steady, carrying a weight that belied his age. The courtroom held its breath once again. Every adult present realized that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The child's perception had pierced the complex layers of legal procedure, exposing a truth that was immediate, tangible, and undeniable. The gallery erupted into a low murmur. Spectators whispered to one another, trying to process the significance of what had just occurred. Some doubted the legal relevance of a toddler's words, yet none could deny their emotional resonance. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing phrases like "the toddler speaks truth" and "jury stunned by child witness." Even seasoned attorneys and law enforcement officers exchanged subtle nods, acknowledging that human intuition, unfiltered by training or procedure, could wield a power that no document, chart, or demonstration could replicate. Danny Miller's relief was palpable. He leaned forward slightly, gripping the edge of the defense table, tears threatening to spill. His son had spoken a truth that validated everything he had felt that night, everything he had hoped would be recognized in the courtroom. The simplicity of Lucas' statement carried a force that overshadowed complicated testimonies, technical explanations, and procedural arguments. It was, in its way, the purest form of evidence, honesty, observation, and instinct delivered without hesitation or artifice. The judge, recognizing the uniqueness of the moment, allowed a brief pause. He glanced at the attorneys and the jury, then at Lucas. "We will proceed carefully," he said, his voice steady but tinged with curiosity. "This is certainly unusual, but it is part of the trial record, and the jury will weigh it accordingly." His acknowledgement gave Lucas' words legitimacy without transforming them into formal testimony, preserving both the procedural integrity of the court and the extraordinary nature of the child's insight. The prosecution attempted to regain control, presenting additional evidence and reiterating Rex's training and reliability. But the energy in the courtroom had shifted irreversibly. The jurors were no longer passive observers of a procedural performance. They were participants in a narrative, now influenced by innocence itself. Every diagram, every chart, every demonstration of the dog's abilities was filtered through the lens of Lucas' observation. The perception of the trial had changed, and no amount of argument could fully undo that effect. As the morning session drew to a close, the weight of Lucas' statement lingered. Spectators whispered, jurors reflected, and attorneys adjusted their strategies in real time. The courtroom had become a theater of unexpected revelation, where a child's unfiltered voice challenged assumptions and illuminated nuances, invisible to even the most experienced eyes. Lucas, oblivious to the magnitude of his impact, continued to clutch his toy car, his gaze occasionally meeting his father's, sharing a quiet understanding that transcended words. In that tense, charged environment, it became clear that the trial of Daniel Miller was no longer solely about legal procedure, police testimony, or the evidence of a decorated dog. It had evolved into a story about perception, instinct, and the unexpected clarity that emerges from innocence. Lucas Miller, a 3-year-old boy, had altered the course of the trial with nothing more than honesty and observation, leaving the jury, the courtroom, and the town suspended in awe at the power of a child's voice. As the court recessed for lunch, murmurs filled the hallways. Observers speculated about how the simple words of a toddler could sway opinions that had seemed fixed. Lawyers exchanged quiet nods of respect, realizing that procedural expertise had been met and subtly challenged by something far more primal, instinct and truth, delivered through a child's eyes. And in the back of the courtroom, Lucas Miller sat quietly, toy car in hand, unaware that he had just left an indelible mark on everyone present. The child's voice had broken the silence, and in doing so, it had rewritten the energy of the trial. What had begun as a straightforward burglary case had now transformed into a story about perception, innocence, and the subtle yet profound power of truth. And as the courtroom emptied for a brief recess, one thing was clear. The proceedings would never be the same, because the youngest witness in the room had spoken, and everyone had listened. The courtroom had never been quieter. Even after recess, the echoes of Lucas Miller's words seemed to linger in the air, invisible yet tangible. "It wasn't Daddy." The simplicity and clarity of the statement had sent a shockwave through the room. Jurors, once focused entirely on charts, testimonies, and Rex's impeccable tracking record, now found themselves replaying the toddler's words in their minds. It was a small sentence, almost poetic in its brevity, yet its weight pressed upon everyone present. Adults who prided themselves on objectivity felt a sudden, inexplicable tug at their emotions. Some jurors shifted uneasily in their seats, pens paused above their notebooks. They had been taught to rely on evidence, logic, and procedure, yet the child's statement introduced a form of evidence that was neither formal nor measurable. It was perception, distilled into pure honesty, unclouded by bias or interpretation. Even the seasoned jurors, experienced in evaluating police testimony and expert reports, felt a subtle uncertainty creeping in. Could a toddler really perceive what adults overlooked? Could this innocence carry more truth than charts, diagrams, and dog training records? Across the room, whispers began, subdued but persistent. Some spectators exchanged glances, unsure whether to laugh, marvel, or remain silent. The prosecution paused, glancing at one another with tense expressions. Their strategy had relied heavily on Rex, whose movements had seemed conclusive evidence of the defendant's presence at the crime scene. But now, the impact of the child's observation was undeniable, piercing through layers of authority and discipline that had seemed unassailable. The courtroom had shifted from a theater of procedure to a space where instinct and harm perception challenged the very notion of certainty. Marissa Cole, Danny's defense attorney, watched the subtle effects on the jury with a keen eye. She knew the law valued facts, but she also understood the human element of judgment. The child's statement was not formal evidence, yet it had introduced reasonable doubt. Every juror, consciously or subconsciously, was now forced to re-evaluate the timeline, the dog's behavior, and the assumptions that had underpinned the prosecution's narrative. She whispered quietly to Danny, "Watch carefully, as seeds of doubt are taking root." Danny nodded slightly, his eyes moist, barely able to contain the mixture of relief and awe at his son's unexpected contribution. The jurors began to ask themselves subtle questions that had never occurred before the toddler spoke. Was Rex truly following a scent to the exact location? Or had the dog's movements been influenced by other factors, wind, distractions, or familiarity with the neighborhood? Could the pauses and head tilts they had initially overlooked indicate recognition rather than accusation? And most importantly, if a child could intuitively perceive that his father was innocent, did that not warrant consideration? These were not formal inquiries, yet they reshaped the jurors' thought processes in a profound way. Even Judge Alcott appeared affected, though his face remained composed. He watched the interactions carefully, noting the quiet exchanges among jurors, the thoughtful pauses, and the subtle gestures of reconsideration. A seasoned judge, he had presided over countless trials, yet rarely had he witnessed such a potent intersection of innocence and law. Lucas' presence had disrupted the predictable rhythm of courtroom proceedings, forcing the adults to confront the limits of their own perception. It was an anomaly, remarkable in its simplicity and undeniable in its effect. Officer Reynolds, meanwhile, remained composed, but a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. Rex had performed his tasks flawlessly. According to training, yet the child's statement made him consider aspects he had never before contemplated. Could the dog have recognized a familiar person rather than identifying guilt? Could the pauses, the tilts of the head, the soft whines have been misunderstood by adults who sought certainty where instinct and nuance resided? Even the handler of the highly trained canine found himself re-evaluating assumptions he had held as absolute. As the morning session resumed, testimony continued, but the energy in the room had irrevocably changed. Witnesses spoke with precision, but the jury listened differently. The child's words acted like a prism, refracting every detail through a new lens. Evidence that once seemed conclusive was now viewed with skepticism. Observers noted subtle signs of cognitive conflict: furrowed brows, slight frowns, pens, pausing mid-note. Jurors no longer saw a simple path of scent leading to a crime. They now saw hesitation, recognition, and the possibility that instinct and familiarity could have been misread as guilt. The gallery was equally affected. Spectators whispered, realizing that they were witnessing more than a legal proceeding. They were observing a rare moment where innocence, intuition, and human perception intersected with the machinery of law. Some leaned forward, as if physically closer to Lucas' voice would amplify the truth it carried. Others exchanged quiet nods, acknowledging that adults had often overlooked subtle signs that children could perceive with uncanny clarity. Lucas, himself remained calm. He did not yet understand the profound impact of his words, only that he had said what he remembered and observed. His gaze occasionally met his father's, and Danny's reassuring nod reminded him that he had done something important, even if he didn't know why. The toddler's quiet presence had become the focal point of the trial, a silent, unassuming force reshaping the perceptions of everyone in the room. Marissa Cole began to subtly weave the child's perspective into the narrative of the defense. She asked questions of witnesses in a way that highlighted discrepancies, emphasizing moments where human interpretation might differ from trained perception. Every action, every hesitation, every nuance in Rex's behavior became a point of discussion. The child's insight, though simple, provided a framework for reinterpreting evidence, for considering reasonable doubt where none had been acknowledged before. A prosecution attempted to counteract this shift by emphasizing Rex's impeccable training and the documented accuracy of his tracking. Charts were displayed, timelines reviewed, and expert witnesses offered explanations for every pause, sniff, and movement the dog had made. Yet even with all their preparation, the energy of the courtroom had changed. The jurors' attention was no longer passive. It was active, questioning, reflective. Lucas' words had introduced a subtle but undeniable uncertainty, one that no procedural argument could fully dispel. By late morning, the ripple effect was unmistakable. Jurors leaned forward, pens hovering over notes, silently debating the implications of the child's observation. Some scribbled reminders to themselves to weigh Rex's behavior differently, while others simply stared, lost in contemplation. Every adult in the room seemed acutely aware that a 3-year-old's honesty had unsettled the perceived authority of the police evidence. It was a quiet revolution, one that no lawyer, officer, or judge could control. Even spectators in the back rows were drawn into the unfolding drama. Conversations whispered behind gloved hands, expressions of disbelief and fascination etched across their faces. People realized that justice was being shaped not only by procedure, training, or charts, but by perception, instinct, and the clarity of innocence. And in the midst of it all, Lucas Miller sat quietly, absorbing the energy, yet oblivious to the extraordinary role he had just played. Danny Miller felt a swell of gratitude and awe. His son, in his simple, unfiltered way, had done what adults could not. He had forced the courtroom to confront ambiguity, to acknowledge nuance, and to consider the possibility that his father might be innocent. The relief was palpable, yet tempered by the awareness that the trial was far from over. What had begun as a straightforward burglary case had transformed into a study of perception, human instinct, and the subtle truths revealed through innocence. Marissa Cole recognized the moment as a turning point. She quietly adjusted her notes, aware that Lucas' statement had shifted the trajectory of the trial. Every question she asked, every cross-examination she conducted, now had a new dimension. Not only to challenge the evidence, but to allow the jurors to reconcile what they had observed with the simple truth expressed by a child. It was a delicate balance, one that required patience, precision, and an understanding of the profound impact of innocence on perception. As the session progressed toward lunch, the courtroom atmosphere remained charged. The ripple of doubt, introduced by Lucas' words, had spread through every row, influencing jurors, spectators, and even courtroom staff. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable. The trial had transformed, becoming a narrative not only about burglary and evidence, but about trust, observation, and the unexpected clarity that comes from a child's perspective. By the time the court recessed, the tension was thick but measured. Jurors quietly discussed among themselves, exchanging glances and notes. Spectators whispered, eager to recount the moment when a toddler's voice had disrupted expectations and reshaped understanding. Even the prosecution adjusted their approach, acknowledging, however reluctantly, that perception could not be ignored. And through it all, Lucas Miller remained the calm center of a courtroom in flux, toy car in hand, eyes bright with curiosity. Unaware that his words had created a ripple felt by every adult in the room. In that moment, the trial of Daniel Miller had evolved beyond procedure and evidence. It had become a story of instinct, perception, and the profound influence of innocence. Lucas Miller, sitting quietly yet observing intensely, had reminded everyone present that truth is not always measured in charts, diagrams, or authority. Sometimes it emerges from the smallest voices, untainted, unwavering, and unforgettable. And the ripple he had created among the jury would continue to grow, shaping the trial in ways no one could yet predict. The courtroom atmosphere had transformed since Lucas Miller had spoken. His simple, unwavering words, "It wasn't Daddy," echoed in the minds of everyone present. What had begun as a routine burglary trial had become a study of perception, instinct, and the subtle ways innocence can challenge authority. Jurors leaned forward in their seats, pens poised but hesitant, as if unsure how to reconcile the child's observation with the formal evidence laid before them. The gallery, too, was silent yet electric, every spectator aware that they were witnessing a rare collision of logic and instinct. Marissa Cole, the defense attorney, recognized the profound shift. Her strategy had always relied on challenging assumptions and emphasizing reasonable doubt, but Lucas' statement had provided an unassailable anchor for her argument. She moved quietly among her notes, planning her next steps with precision. The child's insight, pure and unfiltered, could not be contested directly by charts, testimonies, or the meticulous records of Rex's movements. It was an honesty that transcended the procedural nature of the trial. Danny Miller sat at the defense table, visibly buoyed by the impact of his son's presence. The tension in his shoulders had eased slightly, replaced by a careful hope that the court might finally see the truth. He stole a quick glance at Lucas, who remained calm, gripping his toy car, his eyes bright and alert. The boy's innocence had introduced a nuance no adult could replicate, a perspective shaped not by experience or training, but by instinct and observation. The prosecution attempted to regain their footing. They called a series of expert witnesses to reaffirm the accuracy of Rex's tracking. Charts were presented, meticulous diagrams displayed, and detailed explanations delivered in precise, rehearsed tones. Yet the room no longer absorbed these presentations passively. Every juror seemed to filter the information through the lens of Lucas' observation. The dog's behavior, once viewed as indisputable evidence, was now scrutinized for subtle hesitations, moments of recognition, and nuances that could suggest familiarity rather than guilt. As the morning session progressed, Marissa Cole subtly guided her questions to highlight these nuances. She asked officers to describe the specific moments when Rex had paused or tilted his head, prompting explanations that revealed ambiguity in the dog's actions. Every hesitation, every sniff, every brief glance toward Danny became a point of reconsideration. The jurors, already primed by Lucas' words, began to notice patterns that had previously escaped their attention. Even those who had initially been convinced by the prosecution's evidence now paused, reflecting on the possibility that instinct could be misinterpreted. The gallery shifted in response. Spectators whispered quietly, exchanging observations and speculation. Some remarked on the courage of a toddler whose insight had unsettled the courtroom. Others marveled at the unexpected clarity a child could provide. Reporters scribbled notes, capturing phrases like "innocence challenges authority" and "toddler's perspective reshapes trial." The courtroom itself seemed to pulse with the tension of shifting perspectives, every observer aware that the narrative had changed irreversibly. Lucas, unaware of the growing impact of his presence, leaned forward slightly in his chair. His gaze remained fixed on Rex, the dog, and on his father, who sat patiently at the defense table. The boy's small mind catalogued every movement, every subtle signal. He did not need legal terminology to understand what he observed. His memory of that night, the pause, the tilt of the dog's head, the soft whine, gave him clarity that adults lacked. And that clarity had already begun to ripple through the courtroom, reshaping perceptions and planting seeds of doubt. The defense capitalized on this moment with care. Marissa Cole called Officer Reynolds to clarify one key aspect of Rex's behavior. "Can you explain why the dog paused at that specific point?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral yet deliberate. Officer Reynolds responded professionally, emphasizing training and scent tracking. But his words inadvertently highlighted that even a well-trained K9 could display behaviors open to interpretation. The subtle acknowledgement of ambiguity reinforced the jurors' growing awareness that certainty was elusive. Even with expert evidence, jurors began to engage more actively, their body language reflecting cognitive conflict. Some scribbled notes, underlining or circling details for reconsideration. Others leaned back, brow furrowed, silently replaying Lucas' words and comparing them with the evidence presented. The courtroom, once a theater of procedure, had evolved into a dynamic space where every piece of information was filtered through observation, instinct, and human perception. The child's statement had not only introduced doubt, it had reshaped the way adults processed the trial entirely. Even Judge Olcott noticed the subtle but undeniable shift. He observed jurors exchanging glances, nodding slightly to themselves, and adjusting their pens. He had presided over countless trials, yet rarely had he seen a single moment of innocence reverberate so profoundly through the courtroom. He allowed the proceedings to continue without interruption, understanding that the evolving perceptions of the jury were as critical as the formal arguments themselves. The prosecution, sensing the subtle erosion of their authority, attempted to reassert control. They emphasized the precision of Rex's tracking, the accolades the dog had received, and the consistency of the officer's training. Charts and diagrams were revisited, timelines reiterated, and expert analysis repeated. Yet the jurors' focus had shifted. They were no longer passive recipients of information. They were active evaluators, weighing every fact against the child's observation. And with each passing moment, the impact of innocence, the perspective of a 3-year-old grew stronger. Lucas, still calm and quiet, had become a silent force in the courtroom. Every subtle glance, every observation he made, seemed to carry weight beyond his years. He had already disrupted assumptions and forced adults to confront the limitations of their own perceptions. Now, as the trial continued, his presence acted as a touchstone, a reminder that truth often exists beyond procedure, training, and authority. The jurors' perceptions were shifting, quietly, steadily, and irrevocably. Marissa Cole knew this was the defense's pivotal moment. She guided her questions to highlight the ambiguity in the dog's behavior and the possibility of misinterpretation. "Is it possible," she asked, "that Rex's behavior could indicate recognition rather than guilt?" Officer Reynolds responded with professionalism, but the subtle admission of possibility reinforced the jurors' reconsideration. Every adult in the room could feel the narrative bending, adapting to the perspective of a child whose honesty was undeniable. Gallery murmured quietly, captivated by the unfolding dynamics. Spectators recognized that they were witnessing more than a courtroom trial. They were observing the transformative power of perception. A child's voice had introduced doubt where none had existed, and now that doubt was spreading like ripples across a pond, touching every mind in the room. It was a lesson in humility, in awareness, and in the extraordinary clarity that can emerge from innocence. As the day wore on, the ripple effect of Lucas' words continued to grow. Jurors' body language reflected engagement and contemplation. Some took notes meticulously, analyzing subtleties in the dog's behavior that had once seemed irrelevant. Others leaned back, absorbed in thought, replaying Lucas' statements and comparing them with each witness's testimony. The courtroom, once dominated by procedure and authority, had evolved into a space where observation, intuition, and perception carried as much weight as formal evidence. Danny Miller felt a mix of hope and trepidation. His son had introduced a force no adult could replicate, but the trial was not over. He watched Lucas carefully, gratitude swelling in his chest. The boy's honesty had already reshaped perceptions, and now Danny silently hoped that the jury would follow that shift to its logical conclusion, recognizing his innocence. The courtroom was no longer a place of certainty. It was a living, breathing arena of judgment, influenced by instinct, observation, and the quiet power of a child's voice. By late afternoon, it became clear that the trial had reached a critical turning point. The ripple effect of Lucas' words had altered the perceptions of every juror, the energy in the room, and even the approach of the attorneys. What had begun as a straightforward burglary case was now a narrative about perception, honesty, and the subtle power of innocence. Every adult present was acutely aware that the courtroom had changed, that the trial had shifted, and that the simplest words of a child could carry consequences far beyond expectation. As the court recessed for a day, whispers filled the hallways. Reporters speculated on how a toddler's insight could influence legal outcomes. Spectators exchanged glances, marveling at the unusual and compelling intersection of innocence and authority. And Lucas Miller, oblivious to the magnitude of his impact, continued to hold his toy car, his bright eyes scanning the room, quietly absorbing the tension and anticipation of a trial forever altered by a child's voice. In that charged, evolving courtroom, one fact had become undeniably clear. The perspectives of the jurors had shifted, subtly but irrevocably. Innocence had pierced authority. Perception had challenged procedure. And at the center of it all, Lucas Miller had become the quiet catalyst for a transformation no one had anticipated. A 3-year-old whose observation would shape the trial in ways that logic and evidence alone could never achieve. The courtroom was quieter than it had been at any point during the trial. The morning sun poured through the tall windows, illuminating the polished wood floors and casting long shadows across the gallery. Jurors sat in tense anticipation, their expressions a mixture of contemplation, uncertainty, and quiet resolve. Lucas Miller, seated beside his grandmother, clutched his toy car tightly. He had observed every subtle interaction, every gesture, every pause that morning, and though he didn't understand the weight of what was about to happen, he sensed the importance of the moment. Danny Miller sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly. Months of anxiety, preparation, and uncertainty had led to this moment, the culmination of a trial that had been transformed by the simple words of his 3-year-old son. Marissa Cole, calm but vigilant, whispered a final reassurance to him. "Stay focused, Danny. The truth has a way of coming out." Danny nodded, though his chest rose and fell with visible tension. Every nerve in his body seemed attuned to the hushed energy in the courtroom. Judge Alcott cleared his throat, signaling the next phase of the trial. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, his voice steady and authoritative, "you have heard all the testimony, observed all the demonstrations, and considered all the evidence. You may now retire to deliberate and reach a verdict." The jurors rose quietly, their movements deliberate, and filed out into the deliberation room. The courtroom fell into a tense, expectant silence, broken only by the soft rustle of papers and the faint click of pens in the gallery. Outside the deliberation room, whispers spread quickly. Spectators speculated on the likely outcome, with many reflecting on the extraordinary impact of Lucas's statements. Reporters scribbled notes feverishly, trying to capture the moment that had already become legend in the small town. Even officers, witnesses, and court staff seemed aware that the trial had evolved into something far larger than the legal proceedings themselves. It was no longer just about burglary. It was about perception, instinct, and the profound power of a child's truth. Inside the deliberation room, the jurors debated quietly but passionately. The prosecution's evidence was strong on the surface, particularly Rex's impressive tracking demonstration. Charts, timelines, and expert analysis suggested a clear path to conviction. Yet the child's observation hung over every discussion like a shadow of doubt. "It wasn't Daddy," Lucas had said. The words were simple, yet they introduced a depth of complexity no amount of procedural evidence could erase. Every juror wrestled with this tension between training, logic, and instinct, and the innocent yet piercing observation of a 3-year-old. Some jurors argued for caution. They emphasized Rex's training, the consistency of the evidence, and the professionalism of the police officers. "The dog is highly trained," one said quietly. "Its tracking is reliable. The demonstration was thorough." Yet others countered, pointing to the child's perception, the subtle behaviors in Rex that could indicate recognition rather than guilt, and the hesitation that Lucas had observed. "A child sees what adults often overlook," another juror said. "We can't ignore that insight. It's part of what we're supposed to consider." The debate was intense but respectful, each juror weighing facts, instincts, and human perception with care. Slowly, consensus began to emerge. The ripple Lucas had created was evident in every conversation, in every acknowledgement of uncertainty, and in the growing recognition that evidence alone did not capture the full truth. The jurors realized that the trial was not only about procedural certainty, but also about observing reality through a lens untarnished by preconception, exactly what Lucas had provided. After what felt like hours, the jury reached a decision. They returned to the courtroom, moving with deliberate calm, their faces solemn yet composed. The spectators leaned forward, holding their breath. The attorneys adjusted their notes, each sensing the moment's gravity. Danny Miller's hands trembled slightly as he clasped them together, glancing at Lucas, whose bright eyes were fixed on the jurors, as if he sensed the significance of the moment without fully understanding it. The jury foreperson stood, holding the verdict sheet. Silence enveloped the courtroom as Judge Alcott nodded. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" he asked. The foreperson's voice was steady, but it carried an undertone of emotion. "We have, Your Honor." A pause, then the words. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Daniel Miller, not guilty." A ripple of astonishment spread through the room. Some spectators gasped audibly. Others whispered in disbelief. Danny Miller's shoulders sagged in relief, tears welling in his eyes. Marissa Cole allowed herself a quiet smile, recognizing the culmination of months of careful strategy, hope, and reliance on truth. Lucas, oblivious to the legal terminology, tilted his head curiously and said softly, "Daddy's okay." Judge Alcott allowed the declaration to resonate, nodding solemnly. "The defendant is free to go," he said, banging the gavel lightly to signify the formal conclusion of the trial. The courtroom erupted into a controlled hum of murmurs, applause, and quiet exclamations of relief. Spectators rushed forward to shake Danny's hand or embrace him, the town's collective awe and admiration palpable. It was a moment of justice, emotion, and unexpected revelation all at once. The prosecution sat in stunned silence. Their meticulously prepared case had been challenged not by expert testimony or evidence manipulation, but by the honest, unfiltered perception of a child. Officer Reynolds, while maintaining professional composure, allowed himself a subtle nod of respect for the process, recognizing that even the most disciplined canine and the most thorough procedures could not replace the clarity of instinct and observation, particularly when seen through the eyes of innocence. Danny approached Lucas, kneeling slightly to meet his son's gaze. "You did it," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You helped everyone see the truth." Lucas smiled faintly, holding out his toy car. "Here," he said. "For Rex." Danny chuckled, brushing tears from his eyes. Even in this moment of triumph, the bond between father, son, and the German shepherd remained palpable, a silent acknowledgement of loyalty, understanding, and trust that transcended the courtroom drama. Marissa Cole addressed the courtroom, briefly acknowledging the jurors' careful deliberation. "Justice," she said softly, "is not always about the loudest evidence, the clearest charts, or the most rehearsed arguments. Sometimes it is about observing truth, acknowledging perspective, and listening to voices we might otherwise overlook." Her words resonated deeply, capturing the extraordinary lesson the trial had provided, that innocence and perception can illuminate truth in ways adults often miss. The gallery continued to buzz with subdued excitement as people reflected on what they had witnessed. Many remarked that they had seen history in motion, not a legal precedent, but a human one. A child had spoken, and in doing so, had shifted perceptions, introduced doubt, and helped guide justice to its rightful conclusion. The story of Lucas Miller and Rex, the police dog, would ripple through the town and beyond, becoming a tale told not only for its legal outcome, but for its profound insight into the human experience. Outside the courthouse, the sun was higher, casting golden light on the steps where townspeople gathered, exchanging stories of the trial and marveling at its unusual resolution. Reporters crowded around, eager to capture interviews, photographs, and reactions. Many sought to ask Lucas questions, but his grandmother gently guided him away, protecting his innocence while allowing him a quiet moment of pride. The story of a toddler speaking truth to authority had already captured hearts, and it would continue to do so for years to come. Back inside, Rex remained calm at Officer Reynolds' side, his loyalty unwavering. The dog's behavior throughout the trial had been exemplary, but it was Lucas' observation that had illuminated the nuances adults had missed. The bond between child, father, and dog had proven that truth is often found not only in procedure and training, but in trust, perception, and instinct. And in that bond, everyone in the courtroom glimpsed a rare and unshakable clarity, a reminder that justice is sometimes guided by the smallest, most unexpected voices. Danny Miller embraced Lucas, holding him close while tears streamed freely. The relief, joy, and gratitude were overwhelming, yet tempered by awe at the extraordinary way the trial had unfolded. His son, a 3-year-old, had become the quiet catalyst for justice, reminding every adult present that innocence has a power, all its own, a force that can clarify perception, illuminate truth, and alter the course of events with a single, unfiltered statement. As the courthouse emptied, the story lingered in every mind. Spectators, jurors, attorneys, and law enforcement officers carried with them the lesson of that extraordinary day, that even in the most formal procedural settings, human perception and honest observation can transcend authority and training. Lucas Miller's voice, small yet piercing, had changed everything. And as the town absorbed the story, the narrative of justice, instinct, and innocence would be retold countless times, a testament to the enduring power of a child's truth. In the quiet aftermath, Lucas held his toy car, sitting with his father and grandmother. He didn't understand the significance of the verdict, but he felt the relief, the love, and the bond that had been reinforced through an extraordinary act of observation. For everyone else, the story would become legend. A toddler speaking to a police dog in court, leaving an entire jury and a town speechless, and in doing so, illuminating the truth in a way no adult could replicate.